For those who don't know me, my name is Muna Dajani. I'm a professor of urban studies and politics in the graduate program in urbanism. I wish in urban planning, policy and design, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce day 2 of City Debates. We start this morning with a pre-recorded panel with the panelists who were unable to join us in person, but who were kind enough to be with us online. Without further ado, to catch up with the schedule, I will give the floor to Salim Rouhana, who's with us this early morning with a lot of appreciation from us. Salim is a program leader for sustainable development sectors covering MENA region at the World Bank Group. He's currently based in Beirut. He coordinates water, agriculture, urban and resilience, environment and social development sectors. He is also the Mashriq focal point on climate change and is working on the broader whole economy green recovery efforts. Prior to his position at the World Bank, Salim was a senior urban governance and resilience and task team leader covering Africa, East Asia and Middle East and North Africa regions, focusing on decentralization, urban local governance, city competitiveness, territorial and spatial development, and disaster risk management, among others. He has extensive experience working for private sector consulting firms as an urban planner and architect. He has a BA in architecture and MA degrees in architecture, political science with a focus on international affairs and diplomacy, urban planning and development, and an executive master's in business administration. The panel is in very good hands. We have 4 presentations. Salim, would you like to introduce them? I'll give you the floor and let you manage the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks all. But so do you want me to introduce the 4 of them? Okay, perfect. So first I want to thank AUB and the Urban Lab for having me here, and it's a real pleasure. I was telling Muna yesterday that I was the Munas, that I was here for the first edition and the second edition before I left the country. So it's very nice to be back in a different capacity. But as a student, absolutely, and it's I looked much younger. But كمان, I think I remember it vividly. Every year when this event happens, when I can't make it here, I always think, what a missed opportunity. I believe generally that this event is one of the most important think moments actually in the Arab world. So I'm very happy to be here. Yesterday also Noor's presentation was amazing. And I was very touched. It reminded me of how to stay awake consciously in a moment where we all, and it was mentioned yesterday many times, we feel incapable of doing anything. But at least I hope our brain still is capable and still acts. So moving into our session, Financialized Cities, and honestly it was the first time I hear that term when I received the invite. So I was a bit struggling to bring in some elements of thoughts into this. I do belong to a school of financing cities, and from that naive school of believing that cities need financing to be able to grow, to be able to adapt to shocks, and also to be able to deliver what cities are meant to do, which is create opportunities for its inhabitants, and also create a space of inclusion and a space of hope. Sadly, in the world, and most importantly in the Arab world, our cities don't do that, and most of the time we do not finance cities, but we financialize cities, if I'm trying to say it rightly. And the difference, at least the way I'm interpreting it right now, and I will talk, and I will allow the speakers to talk much more about that, is instead of being an agent in what we do, is being a receiver and a receiver of shocks and receiver of financing, and lack agency in shaping how our cities have to be and how our cities should grow eventually and deliver its services and its opportunities to its residents. I think that's maybe for me, having worked.
Recording in progress.
So now everything I say makes sense. Before it didn't. No, but it's really a matter of how do we link financing with the different sources that those come with, and the different directions those come to our cities, with elements such as climate shocks, such as conflict, and such as weak governance and almost failed cities and failed states. So how do those elements interact? And a country like Lebanon has so much experience in witnessing this happen to it, but cities in the Arab world and globally, as we'll hear also today, are also kind of have so much experience to share in this regard. So without further ado, I think I'll just want to introduce very briefly, with bios, of course, in the link and in the website, more detailed. And because their bios are more impressive than mine, I'll be very short on theirs so that I'm not intimidated. But we have Asil Al-Ragam, who's an associate professor and the director of the Design Development and Research Lab at Kuwait University's College of Architecture. We have Ozan Karaman, CNRS Research in Urban Geography, based in LATS, Research Center on Technologies, Territories and Societies in France. We have Zeinab Shuker, who is a fellow at Century International and an assistant professor of sociology at Sam Houston State University in Texas. And we have Muna Dajani, who is an action research with a background in critical political ecology, and Muna will criticize my work most, as you're up to see. So let's pass to that, and I'm really very honored again to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening to those presentations.
Hi everyone. I hope all is well. Thank you so much for being here. I'm coming to you from Houston, Texas. So by the time we're going to have our live discussion, it's probably going to be 2 a.m. But I'm really excited to be here with you. Thank you so much for the organizers. Thank you so much for the invitation. I wish I was there with you in person. I lived in Beirut for a while, so I really love the city. It's my second home and I really enjoy it. But unfortunately, there are some sort of personal and other circumstances that, stopped me from joining in person. But I'm really happy to be here. Really happy to discuss my work with you today for a little bit, and then, be there for the live session for the, any questions or comments and further discussions we will have. My name is Zeinab Shuker, and I am an assistant professor of sociology at Sam Houston State University here in Texas. And I work and study and teach and write about specifically the political economy of Iraq and regime formation, et cetera, and specifically in relation to climate change. So I work on climate change stuff in relation to Iraq and the Middle East, and I look at how climate change and environmental degradation have social, economic, and political impacts on communities and societies and so on. And so the topic that I will be talking about today, it's a topic that's still in its sort of early stages of development, but it's something that I've been interested in for a while as someone who was born and raised in Baghdad and who have seen the changes that Baghdad have witnessed when I was living in Baghdad and in more recent years when I came to visit, and what does that look like? So the topic is the changing faces of Baghdad, corruption, urbanization, and environmental degradation. And I am specifically looking at how the housing sector has changed since 2003 and what these changes look like, what are the conditions that led to these changes, and what are some of the consequences of these changes. If you've been to Baghdad in the past, it has such a beautiful, design and style of homes and houses, and green spaces are an essential part of the house and, essential part of meetings and community and so on. And we are seeing that disappearing significantly since 2003. So I'm interested in seeing what's going on. What does that look like? What are the conditions that leading to these changes? And what are the consequences specifically in relation to environmental degradation and so on? And so I will argue that sort of the current housing crisis is a combination of multiple things. We have a shortage in available houses in general. We have increases in prices. Baghdad is one of the most expensive cities in the world for price for like housing. And it's like competing with like places like Paris and Tokyo and so on, minus the services and minus the infrastructure. Usually there is very poor material and designs that are being employed. So housing in Baghdad and specifically in Iraq in general was designed and materials were used to accommodate the summer heats. So summer in Iraq is incredibly intense. And so the homes were built in a way to create a more livable conditions and situation for the people to live comfortably. And we are seeing a shift in that sense that the material and the designs are actually creating little hut ovens for the population, as well as we are seeing an increase in informal housing, and there are multiple reasons for that. So really, the housing crisis in the country is a combination of multiple things. And these issues are leading to really alarming shift in the histories of the architectural history of the city. We are seeing a disappearance of green spaces, increased pollution, and there's many, many layers of economic, social, and political crises that we really do not even know the extent of because it's impacting generations that are now coming of age, right? Children and teenagers and like some youth. And so like, how is that gonna manifest later in later years? It's still not fully known, but we know it's not gonna be good or pretty to look at. So when we talk about shortage in terms of housing, we're talking about a major shortage, right? We have about 3 to 3.5 million shortage, like housing shortage in the country. This is according to the Ministry of Planning. The Ministry of Planning is not a very credible source all the time. They often lack data and there's not a lot of information out there. So it's probably even worse than that. This is just some of the official numbers. And like I mentioned, it reflects multiple layers of the problem. So the question is, what's happening? What are the conditions that leading to this shortage of housing? And I think it's really important, even though I'm looking at 2003 and post-2003 era, to understand that the housing crisis in Iraq has a long history and roots that existed before 2003. It did not just emerge all of a sudden. So when we think of like sort of the history of the housing sector in Iraq, we can argue that maybe the 50s and 60s were like the 70s were like the good days, right? In the sense that there were political interest, there was a lot of research being done, and most specifically in the 70s, there was a lot of resources due to the nationalization of the oil sector and the increase in prices. So there were a lot of projects that are being done to address the housing crisis, specifically to address the slum problem and sort of like lower income and providing lower income houses for like lower working class and so on. However, all of that came to a halt starting in the 80s, and this is really where the crisis started. Iraq had the 8-year war with Iran that lasted for 8 years. A lot of these resources were directed, rather than building infrastructure and housing, it were directed to the war efforts. And then Saddam invaded Kuwait, and then the US and allies bombed Iraq. And the bombing was not only targeting like military infrastructure and so on, but it was specifically targeting, infrastructure necessary for life, like water purification plants and streets and bridges and electricity units and so on. So it really undermined the infrastructure. And then that was followed by economic sanctions, meaning not a lot of resources and material were coming to the country so the country can rebuilt. That didn't mean Saddam did not have a lot of palaces. I think he had about 75 palaces. So there were resources. He chose not to invest those into, him and his regime decided not to invest those into developing the housing sector. As the population is increasing, the resources remained exactly the same. Then 2003 came, and again, a lot of violence associated with that. But it was a moment of optimism because a lot of investors felt like it's time, right? Iraq will be open to the market and it's time to build and invest. But a lot of that, again, came to a halt in 2006 and 2007 with the civil war. So prices really dropped for houses, and a lot of people ended up selling really cheaply. So we were talking about decades of population that's increasing, but houses are not increasing with the population, and quality that's deteriorating, not only because they're not being updated, but because they are destroyed because of many conflicts and wars throughout the years. The second really crucial thing to keep in mind, or second element that is responsible to this housing crisis, it's the nature of the regime. And I think this is a core reason for why post-2003 we did not see the development that we were hoping for in terms of developing houses and developing the housing sector, not only for the middle class and upper classes, but specifically for the lower classes and the increasing population and the youth. The regime in Iraq is what we call a hybrid rentier model. The main sector of the economy, the only commodity the economy has, is oil. And oil generates a lot of problems on an economic and political perspective. But also the regime that's associated with that kind of economic system is a hybrid regime. It's kind of similar to what's going on in Lebanon, in the sense that you have multiple actors, they're like sort of like states within the state. They capture the state and capture the resources within the state, and they use the money from oil to their own project, their own militias, their own ideological project, and so on, rather than building state institutions. They're not invested in building state institutions because their survival depend on a very weak state and very weak institutions and very corrupt system. And so we find a system that was built on weakening institutions to limit regulations and laws, et cetera, on every single level of society, including housing. And corruption became the ultimate feature of the Iraqi political and economic system post-2003. Iraq is ranked about 153 out of 180 countries, according to the corruption index in 2023. So that is a core problem. The nature of the system is corrupt. It came after many years of poor development and conflict. The Iraqi system, the Iraqi economic system, is very cash-based. So the combination of that cash-based economy, that corrupt system, and as well as sort of US and international forces really enforcing a lot of regulation in terms of how much money can be transferred outside of the country because of corruption. A lot of politicians, a lot of businessmen who now own millions, maybe billions of dollars due to their access to the state and to the resources within the state, and who cannot take that money outside of the country, decided to launder that money specifically through the housing sector. So they will invest into buying malls, building restaurants, and of course, building and buying a lot of houses to really expensive prices. And oftentimes, because like I mentioned, the institutions are super weak, there is really no system to regulate and trace back where this money is coming from. You pay with cash, you pay, couple $1 million for a house in cash, and no one can really trace it back. There's also another layer. Oftentimes they will tend to register these houses and put this property in the names of relatives, wives, etc., to ensure there is an even further layer of separation. And in fact, the more expensive the house is, the better. They do not negotiate. They actually want a more expensive house because it's a money laundering operation rather than actually buying property. So now you can see the population is increasing, the housing are not improving, and now you have folks who are pushing the prices up because of the nature of the economic system and how they are invested in it. And there is many examples of what does that look like. Specifically, there was a theft called the theft of the century that happened in Iraq last year. I think there was about $2.5 billion that were stolen, and it was done like a businessman done it, but in cooperation with political actors and those very well embedded in the state, specifically at the Prime Minister's office. And there were approximately 55 properties that were confiscated that are worth about $286 million. This is only a small sample of what was confiscated. There are many other similar deals, maybe not as intense layers of corruption, but that just kind of go unnoticed or uncaptured. And, this is a system that just kind of keep on going. Of course, You can imagine, since these elites and political and economic actors are very much invested into this like money machine capturing corruption situation, there's very limited interest into building infrastructure and developing the falling apart infrastructure. Specifically in relation to the housing sector. So one way to address the problem, the government, for example, decided in 2013 to distribute about hundreds of thousands of urban plots. A lot of these plots happen to be outside of like Baghdad, like around the city, in farming land. However, there was like absolutely no infrastructure in these places. People will go and they will find just like an empty piece of land in the middle of nowhere. It was not connected to the grid. It was not connected to electricity, water. There were like no roads leading to it. So it was, for a lot of folks, even though they have the land, they couldn't build on it because it was really expensive. Meaning that the city now is, everyone is trying to stay within the center of the city because this is where the very limited resources are located, which increases competition because there's not a lot of space to expand the city itself. Of course, all of this, as the housing is not increasing, what we are seeing is an increase in population. So right now in 2023, Iraq population is about 46 million. It was about 17 million in 1990. And there's approximately 1 million increase each year, expecting to reach 80 million in 2050 and 100 million by 2085. Most of that increase is happening within the youth population. So we are experiencing a youth bulge, meaning that approximately 60% of the population is under 25. These are the people who are going to start a family, going to build a life, they're going to, have children. These are the people who are in need of housing. There's a new generation of folks who are going to need to live somewhere. At the same time, this new generation, there's very high level of unemployment and poverty within that generation. We have approximately 14.2% levels of unemployment and approximately 25% or 11 million people in Iraq who are living in poverty. So we are seeing youth who are in need of housing, but a lot of them are not employed. A lot of them live in poverty, and the housing sector is increasing in prices, and the supply is not meeting the demand that we are seeing. Another key issue, another layer, another added pressure to the housing sector is specifically the displacement we are seeing. So years of conflict, in the country has led to displacement either because of ISIS or because of climate change. And so I'm going to try to go through this a little bit faster, but a lot of these folks have nothing left. They have no land left. They have no resources. So a lot of them are moving to the cities, specifically cities like Baghdad, trying to find housing, employment permanently, right? Because they have nothing else. So not only the city is not expanding and the population is increasing, and the population and the housing sector is not expanding. And then, the people cannot afford the houses are available. But now there are more people coming from rural areas, from other towns, actually coming in, also in search of housing, which is making this a gold mine for investors. That increase in demand and limited supply and corruption and poor regulation and poor infrastructure, meaning an opportunity for really questionable behavior from investors. Usually in Iraq, the houses are about 600-meter plots. So the house, and you have a very big green space, a garden associated with it. And that's how Baghdad used to be designed. But today, because of the increase of demand, and you can sell the houses, a meter can be sold very expensively because of how much there is demand. The houses, these bigger houses are being subdivided into sometimes 10 by 10 meters, tiny spaces. Built very cheaply. Obviously, the green space is no longer a priority because you have now a family, sometimes multiple families living in these places. So you need to maximize all the living space, and the green space is completely disappearing. And even with that, the prices are incredibly expensive. In 2023, places like El Mansour, a square meter can reach up to $10,000. And places like Karada can be about $5,000. That's really expensive for Baghdad. And so it's cheaper. They make more profit, investors and homeowners, by subdividing the house into tiny places. And that's completely changing the face of the city and killing the green spaces. You can only subdivide a house too much. So the alternative is to try to capture other like farms and green spaces and try to use them to develop property. A lot of that is state owned. So, what we will notice is a lot of these investors will try to destroy the land because technically you're not supposed to build on like state property and like farms and so on. So in the middle of the night, they will send folks who will bleach the soil and they will cut the top of the palm trees like we will see in this picture. To destroy the land completely. The palm tree will continue to absorb resources from the land, but it no longer can produce anything, making the land completely unusable. So the palm trees are destroyed, the green space is destroyed, and it's used to build further, more like houses. And so not only the existing green spaces within homes are disappearing, but also state-owned green spaces are also disappearing as well. And of course, there's a whole layer of like just poor regulation, meaning poor material dumping illegally in landfills and waterways and so on, which destroying the environment even more. And all of that is happening as Iraq is experiencing a very major climate crisis. Iraq is one of the hottest places on earth. Temperature in Iraq are rising roughly 7 times faster than the global average. Iraq is losing about 60,000 acres of urban land each year. About 92% of land is lost to desertification. Water levels in both Tigris and Euphrates are expected to decline from 30 to 70%. So you can imagine green spaces are incredibly important, but they are just being destroyed, making the climate crisis and environmental degradation even more intense. So we're seeing in the picture on the top, this is from 2002, and the picture on the bottom is from 2021. And you can see how the space is completely different. In fact, green spaces have decreased in Baghdad from 28 to 12% in the past 2 decades in Baghdad alone. And of course, building these like little ovens are turning like this concrete jungle is concrete and metal absorbs heat and then radiated back, turning the city into urban heat islands. And there's no green space to address that, to minimize that problem. Displacement, like I mentioned, it adding to this climate, to the specifically environmental degradation issue. We are seeing many informal settlements, happening in the country. Baghdad has the largest amount of informal settlements in Iraq. And like I mentioned, a lot of these folks are coming from rural areas, whether they're coming due to climate change or coming due to conflict, cannot settle in the city. They have very limited resources, so they are trying to occupy to live and exist in the sort of outskirt of the city. A lot of the outskirt of the city is state-owned farmland, and that is being destroyed as well because this is where people can live, and they try to be as close as possible to the city without actually being in the city. And there are 2 layers of this. There's those folks who are from Baghdad and cannot afford housing in Baghdad, so they're forced to live in informal settlements. I know many of them. And these people are slightly better off because they still have a social network and support in the city itself. They are from the city. But those who are coming from rural areas to Baghdad and places like Al-Basra, specifically farmers, they lack the skill, they lack the social support, they lack the resources, and they're often discriminated against by even their neighbors who are from Baghdad. So they face many layers of issues. Of course, these informal settlements completely lack infrastructure, like I mentioned. I mean, the lands, the plots are distributed by the state, lack infrastructure for you. So you can imagine this is definitely lacks infrastructure, meaning sewage, trash, etc. It's all dumped out there, which is destroying the environment even further and destroying the land that people are living on. And of course, there's other layers of infrastructure issues, which is lack of education, lack of schooling and healthcare. And this is what I meant by we are looking at generations of folks living in toxic environment with very limited resources and no existing available good education and healthcare. And we do have some research indicating that a lot of these folks are actually forced to engage into conflict, whether it's gang activity, militias, a tribal conflict, sometimes even extremist conflict. And so again, this is what I meant by saying we do not fully know the extent of the problem as of yet. And finally, like I mentioned, the disappearing of the green space, the garden in the house, that itself is a major problem, not only on an environmental level, but on a social level. This space is essential for the Iraqi family. Iraqi families, often in the afternoon or in the evening, when the temperatures are lower, they will gather in the garden. The whole family will gather, neighbors will come, other relatives will come. And this is where people interact and socialize. And it's essential for the social cohesion of the community, of the family, or the neighborhood. With that disappearing, there's not a lot of spaces for people to gather and do that kind of activity. What we are seeing is that people now are forced indoors, and the spaces they're both separated but concentrated in one tiny space. So if you live in a very tiny home, and oftentimes we are seeing multi-generation and multi-families living in the space to be able to afford it because of how expensive it is, we're seeing competition over resources, but at the same time as isolation, as people try to curve a space for them and to have some privacy. So they're isolated, but they're competing over resources, creating major social tension within the family. But they're also losing that level of socialization with the community and with the neighbors because there is no place to socialize other than standing in the street. And women really face the burn of that because usually it was a very transitional space between like the indoors and the responsibilities of the indoors and the street and the hostilities of the street. So it was a place to sit and relax and to calm down and just being outside. And they're losing that force either to exist inside in very cramped spaces, doing chores, etc., or existing in a street that are not always welcoming or friendly to them. So it's creating, so there's many economic, political, and social implication of this housing crisis, and specifically environmental ones, which is what I'm interested in. And so I just wanted to highlight some of these key things. This is my email. If you have any questions, get in touch. We can chat more about this. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. And I look forward to, let me stop sharing. Okay, I look forward to our conversation. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Salamat Jamian. It's a pleasure to be joining you today in this very important conference on disrupted urbanism. I'm really grateful for the kind invitation of Dr. Muna Fawaz and Dr. Muna Harb to join you today and these 2 days in Beirut. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it. So I look forward to engaging with you today within this limited time, and hopefully also be able to join some of the sessions by this excellent line of speakers and contributors. I will share my screen now. I wanted to kind of speak of multiple different thematics and different topics as they pertain to the ongoing genocide that has been happening especially in particular, paying attention to the forms of ecocide as a form of genocide. But I also wanted to situate it within a more structural violence that Israel as a settler colonial project has been inflicting on Palestinians' existence on the land and severing of their relationship with that land and natural resources, particularly water, but also other resources. So I wanted to kind of speak a bit about all of these different themes within that limited time that I have. We are witnessing the televised genocide for the past 150 days, feeling helpless and traumatized by our ongoing Nakba and the intensification of settler colonial violence that has been inflicted on us for the past 75 years. As the genocide continues unabated, and even with the green light and clear complicity and involvement of Western government and the silence of those governments near or far, the amount and the level of unimaginable destruction, damage, and alienation of all sources of life in the besieged Gaza Strip has come to us in very painful visual testimonies and evidence and even live streaming of all of these atrocities. I wanted to speak of ecocide. ecocide pertains to the destruction of ecosystems. And it's conceived as part of the genocide-ecocide nexus as a method of genocide if this environmental destruction results in conditions of life that fundamentally threaten a social group's cultural and/or physical existence. And also for legal scholarship, ecocide is used generally to mean severe damage to the natural environment, an intensification of harm and destruction affecting all aspects and all humans, non-humans, soil, water, air, and all the assemblages that make ecosystems function. I also wanted to think of ecocide as also as a heightened intensification of an existing structural violence and damage that the settler colonialism in general actually entails on the livelihood and on the uprooting of communities from their environment. In that lens, we can not speak of the Nakba and itself without speaking of ecocide, that severing of relations between Palestinians and their land, the obliteration, of course, of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, erasing them from their land, destroying of their sources of livelihood and agrarian and agricultural practices, and of course, destroying completely different and multiple valuations and relations that Palestinians have forged with their land, with their ancestral collection. And for that matter, also, this articulation of ecocidal actions and intentions that have been ongoing for decades has also been inflicted on Lebanese environment, Lebanese communities, especially those in the south of Lebanon, in South Lebanon. Or also speaking of the Jawlani, the remaining Syrian community in the occupied Golan Heights, and their complete uprooting from their environments and their ways of finding ways to remain in the occupied Syrian Jawlan. Kyle White argues that colonized people have been enduring climatic and environmental changes, not only recently due to industrialization, but also through centuries of colonialism, due to the colonial forces and regimes extracting their natural resources, dispossessing and erasing indigenous conditions of life, from the killing of indigenous people, the destruction of their livelihood practices, and also taking control over their land. And I see also a lot of connection with that, the present toxic environments and ecosystem collapse that we witness due to the ongoing genocide or the succession of wars and assaults that Israel has been carrying out against Palestinian geographies, but also against Palestinian bodies, and connections to the land are also part of this intensification of environmental change and that has been inflicted upon us. And I wanted to also situate it as part and parcel of levels and structures of infrastructural violence. So in order for the settler colonial state to envision its existence on land that it settles on, it needs to reimagine, it needs to transform. And one of these processes is the process, obviously, of erasure, but it's also the process of building concretized infrastructure to cement their control over territory, cement their control over Palestinian bodies, and sever completely relations between Palestinians and their nature, separating nature from people, following that colonial worldview and logic of separation and hierarchy of the settler colonizers with their discourses of modernity coming to transform desolate land and make the desert bloom. So that form of infrastructural violence in terms of hegemony of ideas remains quite very strongly, and I will show that in the way international aid is carried out in such a depoliticized matter, with the really without any long-term emancipatory potential. So a lot of these projects, I worked on the national water carrier in Israel, embody that type of infrastructural violence, the erasure and replacement of colonized environment and the transformation of that environment. So these type of infrastructure are long-lasting, they're impermeable, supposedly, in the eyes of the colonizer, and they will bring about modernization and bring about transformations of nature and harnessing of that nature that the indigenous has left in a desolate condition. And those tropes and ideas of making the desert bloom continue to be rooted in those, of course, ideas that are still very present until today with the settler colonial project. So these ideas of modernity continues to be, and they are experienced across the political divide, and they are experienced across the political fragmented geographies of Palestine. So whether in 1948 Palestinian citizens who have stayed on their land have been experiencing that infrastructural violence in the form of closing off land and water from their access, and only channeling that water, channeling with that ideologies and convictions and ideas of superiority in those pipelines that have transformed their landscape to the total disregard of Palestinians in 1948. It has also developed across decades, but most intensified version of it is in those decades of the Oslo Accords, where international aid agencies have been reconceptualized as agents of development to aid a nation-state building project in Palestine. That type of infrastructural violence, I see it, is in the way of foreclosing Palestinians' resilience on the land through dictating and through conditional aid and also the sanctioning power of the Israeli settler colonial regime is to dictate what type of infrastructure is to be sanctioned and allowed on Palestinian land, and which of those is deemed to be destroyed. So we see a huge contrast that produces processes of hydroapartheid, that produces processes of ethnic cleansing of certain, especially of certain communities, most notably, Area C in the West Bank, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinian communities have been already been internally displaced, and the remaining ones have been imposed to live, forced to live under conditions of precarity and under conditions of disconnection. And I know Omar Jaberi Salamanca is there today, and he's done brilliant work on those issues and infrastructures. So it is really important to highlight the disposability character that the short term, the ad hoc, the humanitarian infrastructure that Israel sanctions along with the international community, and what type of infrastructures they deny. So we see that kind of humanitarian violence that Eyal Weissman and others have spoken about being completely and very visibly, very visible in our urban centers, in even those areas that are considered to be remote or of humanitarian nature. Of course, all of it imposed and manufactured scarcity of water in those locations. And then the assemblage of how Palestinians access water starts being imbued with these ideas of disposability and the ideas of temporality, foreclosing futures. Coming back to Gaza, and I think it's really important, and this has been done, work that have been highlighted by multiple Palestinians and non-Palestinian scholars on the structural de-development of the besieged Gaza Strip, its separation completely from its extension, from its geographical extension and connections to other Palestinian fragmented geographies, and the imposition of a development narrative and imperative that pushes for the Gaza Strip to be in charge of producing its own water. And the pushing of techno-managerial solutions by the international community, of course, with the approval of Israel for those infrastructures to be produced. Desalination plants has been one of those solutions, techno-managerial solutions that have been proposed and implemented by multinational agencies and organizations in order to increase water availability and reduce the really dire situation of natural water resources in Gaza due to high level of overexploitation that, of course, has historical roots of exploitation as early as the 1960s by Israeli settlement activity and over-abstraction that was happening in the coastal aquifer. So all of these are showing structural violence embedded in those solutions that are put forth by the international aid agencies to alleviate suffering or increase water availability. The late Clemens Messerschmidt has been a hydrologist living in Ramallah for decades, and he has worked extensively on the issue of depoliticization of water and the idea of normalizing situations of water scarcity, where Palestinians are deemed to be living under water scarcity and require these type of interventions, while Israel is seen as a water exporting entity that exports water technology along of its know-how in water development sector. Also based on its theft and expropriation of Palestinian land and water. So I just wanted to end on unfortunately not very good notes, but I wanted to kind of see how desalination has been also used by Palestinians in Gaza to also alleviate that suffering, that imposed humanitarian condition, acute humanitarian condition and violence inflicted upon them, by also finding ways to produce their own energy and produce their own desalination of water to produce the may al-hilwa, the sweet water, the potable water that Palestinians in Gaza have been denied access to for decades and decades. But what we see is that as early as November last year, these desalination plants have been hit directly by an Israeli airstrike, and this desalination plant, has moved to its humanitarian use as they started to reassemble and reoperate the plant with limited resources to provide water for Palestinians who have been seeking shelter in the southern part of Rafah. And have been living without water. So I wanted to end here. I wanted to end on kind of reflecting on this intergenerational toxic relations with water. And those toxic relations with water as they relate to these infrastructures that bring water and bring with it not only water as a necessity of life, but also with it the harm and suffering of the harm and suffering of not being able to access water, not being forced to drink toxic water or polluted water, and being always by multi-generations even, especially when we see children queuing with the yellow jerry cans, with those type of infrastructure that remain and become part and parcel of the lived experience of multi-generations of Palestinians, not only in the Gaza Strip, where water weaponization has been the most severe, but also in other parts of the fragmented geographies of Palestine. So how do we actually confront this severing of relations between water and infrastructure, and reconceptualize and actually showcase how infrastructures can also be sites of countering injustice and achieving emancipation and liberation and reconnections to our land. And I thank you so much for your attention.